Hey, what's going on, guys? Welcome to the channel. I'm Ben. I've been riding this Gen 3 KLR 650 for the last 2 years now, and I've decided that I'm ready for the next step. There are 3 things that I'm interested in when I'm considering an adventure bike. 1 is going to be how well the bike fits me. 2 is going to be how well the bike fits what I want it to do out on the road. And then 3, how well the bike fits what I need it to do off-road. And since we've still got the KLR here, I figure I might as well throw a leg over and show you how somebody my size fits on this bike. I am 5'10", I've got a 31-inch inseam, and I weigh about 160 pounds. This seat height can be somewhat adjusted with the preload on the rear spring. And if I throw a leg over, I can get the balls of both of my feet pretty easily to the ground. I feel fairly stable. I can put my left foot up on the peg and flat foot on this side, no problem. Bike really has no lean. I am, I guess, on the side of the seat a bit. It's definitely a comfy ride on the road and on even ground, but if you get into some off-road terrain where things aren't so even, or when things get maybe a little bit hairy, muddy, sandy, this can be a pretty big bike for somebody that weighs, what, a quarter of what this bike does. This is a heavy machine. But if you guys have seen my other videos, you know that that has not stopped me. I've taken this bike to some insane places. And honestly, with only 40 horsepower, this bike has really impressed me. I've also had this thing out on the freeway doing 70 miles an hour plus for hours at a time. And while it's not the most comfortable or the fastest road bike, it really does do a pretty good job keeping you protected from the wind, and it gives you a pretty solid planted feeling because of the weight of the bike. With only 40 horsepower and 5 speeds, you do find yourself searching for that elusive 6th gear every once in a while, but to be honest, this bike is more than capable of long stints on the highway. Now, of course, I know this is not the bike for everyone, but if you are somebody that has fallen in love with the KLR, it can be a pretty tough act to follow. And to be completely honest, as much as I enjoyed riding the Tenere 700 and as awesome of a bike as that was, I just never quite felt the same connection as I did with my Gen 2 or as I have now with my Gen 3. So if I'm not going to buy another Tenere 700, what are my other options? Let's go find out. So we'll start out with the Transalp Array 750 here. If you guys remember, about a year ago, I did a sort of comparison video between this and the Tenere 700 and kind of bashed it a little bit, but also basically said that I was pretty darn sure that this was going to be my next bike. Now that I've kind of looked into the specs of this bike and a few other of the bikes that we're going to be comparing today, I'm not sure that this is going to be the best option for me, but it is still an option. Base price is $9,999. Let's look for some specs. The motor in here is going to be pretty similar to the Tenere 700, a little bit larger, a few more cc's, but the same parallel twin with a 270-degree crank. What else do they give us here? 6-speed transmission, that's definitely good. Front suspension, travel, and rear suspension are both things we're looking at here. So 7.9 inches on the front, 7.5 on the back. I believe that is a bit less than the KLR. I believe the T7 has something pretty similar to that as well. Front tire, definitely like to see a 21 up front. That is, I guess, what you'd consider sort of the standard for off-road adventure bikes and dual sport motorcycles alike. 18-inch rear is kind of also what you would expect on a dirt bike. 27-degree rake here, that is the measurement for the angle on the forks. The further out the front wheel, the easier it is to sort of float in the sand and the mud. It doesn't get sort of stuck and fight you so much. Definitely noticed a huge difference between a bike with less rake and a bike with more rake when we compared the 800 XC Tiger to the Tenere 700, which has a lot more rake and was much lighter feeling off-road, even though they weigh about the same. Seat height is definitely going to be important for how the bike fits me, 33.7 inches. So that's pretty close to the KLR and actually pretty close to the T7 too, but since the Tenere seat is so wide, it's kind of hard to get your feet to go down when they need to go out first. Fuel capacity, we were definitely interested in 4.5 gallons. Obviously, the more fuel you can carry, the longer you can go, but the more the bike weighs. And we've got a curb weight here of 459 pounds. Curb weight means that all the required fluids are in the bike and that the tank is full of fuel. You also hear this called wet weight, and the opposite of this is going to be a dry weight. And you want to make sure that you're always comparing dry to dry or wet to wet. Tank of fuel can add 20-30 pounds, so it does make a difference. The 8.3 inches of ground clearance definitely is going to be reduced when you go to stick a skid plate on here. And of course, you can't stick your crash protection right up against those pipes. You need some sort of crumple zone there, so that's going to add at least a ½ inch, if not more, plus whatever the thickness of that plate is, and any fasteners that are going to stick down from it. So now, the only two numbers that I was not able to find on the Honda website were the horsepower and torque numbers, which is sort of par for the course. I don't know why the Japanese manufacturers think that that's not an important number to put on there, or if they're purposefully hiding it for some reason. I really don't know. But as best I could tell, the European Transalp is going to get 90 horsepower or make 90 horsepower, and I think maybe get a little bit more torque, but the US model is going to be left with 83 horsepower and 55 foot-pounds of torque after the emissions garbage or whatever it is that they do to it. So it's still going to be a pretty darn fast torquey bike, a lot more power and a lot more torque than the Tenere 700, and of course a lot more than the KLR 650, but a little bit more road bias, a little bit less suspension travel, and definitely not set up to really be an off-road bike from the factory, at least not as far as any sort of ground protection or ground clearance numbers, really. Both of those kind of look much more like an on-road bike, but obviously still can be taken off-road, and looks like it's a good time. So next up, we've got the parallel Strom here, the 800DE. This bike really did get me pretty excited for a while, and there's a reason that I'm thinking maybe this isn't going to be the bike for me. I'm honestly still not sure, which is I guess why we're going through the motions here and trying to figure it out today. But this bike is a little bit pricier than everything else that I'm going to be looking at today. This bike comes in over the $10,000 mark. I've actually seen them in my area, which I guess would have been an older model now, getting kind of close to 2024. The 2023 actually was marked down just $1 below 10 grand. So let's see what sort of information they've got on this one for us here. We've got a couple different color options on this one. And here's our parallel twin engine, again, 270-degree firing order. Like I said, definitely a fun engine, and there's a reason that these guys are all going to this. 776 cc's, so a few less than the Transalp. The bigger the number here, the more power that they're squeezing out of the engine, but of course, the more power that you squeeze out, the reliability sort of kind of goes the opposite direction. So something to be interested in, I guess, but not necessarily something that I look at too closely. Drivetrain, we do have 6-speed. So that is definitely a good thing. That's a leg up over the KLR. Here we go. Suspension with no sort of numbers. We do have wheel size here, though. So we've got a 21 in the front, which is good, and a 17 in the rear, which is okay. 5.3 US gallon tank. Not quite KLR territory, but pretty big. Ground clearance. That's important. Almost a ½ inch more ground clearance than the Transalp, and that is with the skid plate and brackets for the skid plate already installed here. So that definitely is going to be a much better bike off-road as far as ground clearance goes. Seat height, just right about the same as the Transalp Array and the KLR 650. Weight is a bit heavier. So what do we need yet? Suspension travel, right? Here we go. 8.7 inches of stroke on the front, and also 8.7 on the rear. So once again, I didn't find the horsepower or torque numbers on here, but as best I can tell, this bike is going to make about 83 ponies and have about 55 foot-pounds of torque with all of the added off-road type features and the extra ground clearance and suspension travel and just everything that I've heard about this bike from people who have been riding it. It seems like this is going to be a much better option for off-road, just because it's set up already to be an off-road bike. Yeah, you could make the Transalp a much better, much tougher off-road bike, but it's just not ever going to have that extra suspension travel and that extra ground clearance unless you really do something nuts with it, which for $1,000 more, why not just buy the DE800 here? Definitely a nice looking option. Just wish it wasn't so darn heavy. And speaking of really heavy bikes, I decided this time around I was going to give some of the lighter bikes in the adventure class a chance. I have spent the last 7 years trying to
get large bikes to go into tight places that I probably shouldn't. And if you guys have seen the videos, I really have come a long way from back when I started. I've not ridden any of my bikes to their limit, but I've definitely gotten a lot closer than I think a lot of people do. And I really like that. It's been a lot of fun. It makes for good videos, but it's always sort of in the back of my head that if I drop the bike on my leg, I may not be able to walk again for another 6 months. And when you're riding that way all the time, it definitely kind of limits where you go and where you plan to ride. And I think it's just something that maybe I need to rethink. So today we're going to be looking at the KTM 390 here. I'm a little bit embarrassed to admit that I have not considered this bike in a long time because I thought it was only available with cast wheels. And actually last year in 2023, they started selling it with these spoked rims. Now, if you give this bike a quick glance, it may seem pretty proportionally similar to the other bikes that we've been looking at, but this one is actually quite a bit lighter and a bit smaller. And that's why the large front wheel here is maybe a little bit, well, hard to tell what size it actually is. This is going to be a 19-inch front, and in comparison to the bike size, I think it looks about right. It looks adventure, but no matter what, the larger diameter the tire, the sort of higher the axle is going to be on there, meaning that you have a little bit more distance between the ground and where that sort of fulcrum or center point is. And essentially, if your wheel is much larger than an obstacle you're trying to crawl over, that sort of center point is much higher, so you can just easily climb over it. Whereas if you have a rather large obstacle and a smaller wheel in comparison, it's much harder to get it to go up and over. Either way, definitely still good to see spoked wheels on here. Like I said before, I wouldn't even consider it just because cast wheels are not something that's really meant to be off-road. They bend and don't really bend back, whereas a spoked wheel, I can tell you from experience, will take one heck of a beating and most of the time spring back pretty quickly. The rear wheel on here is a 17-inch, which really isn't too bad considering the bike's size. We've got a 373cc power plant here, they call it. And it does actually make a pretty decent amount of power for the weight of the bike anyways. It's actually pretty close to KLR numbers. The KLR puts out about 40 horsepower and, like I said earlier, weighs about 460 pounds. This bike puts out 43 horsepower, but only weighs 390 pounds wet. So that means that this bike is not quite 100 pounds lighter than the KLR, but a decent amount that this thing is going to be a whole world of difference, I think, than riding the KLR. Just even sitting on it, I mean, this thing's going to feel more like a bicycle, I think, than a motorcycle. And honestly, when you're off-road, that of course is going to be a great thing, but on-road, on the highway, the lighter the bike, the easier it's going to be to get pushed around by the wind, and the less planted you're going to feel just kind of in general. Off-road, it's nice because you can flick it around, but on the highway, it sort of can get flicked around. Speaking of highway speeds, though, this does have a 6 gear, so this is almost looking like a KLR 650, just sort of miniature size, but with a 6-speed. So a 3-point-gallon fuel tank and 248 miles to that tank. Obviously, that's not going to be riding off-road or screaming at 70 miles an hour on the highway. That's going to be kind of taking it easy, and things are going to go, downhill if you run it a little bit harder. But honestly, that is also kind of KLR territory, but much more impressive since you don't even have 4 gallons of fuel. So definitely a pretty fuel efficient engine. Something about ABS, that's great. Yeah, you can move the windshield up and down. What else do we have here? So now the bodywork here, this is pretty similar to the 890 and 790 and even the 1290, I think. They've sort of decided to split their headlight fairing, I guess if you could call it that, from the side panels for the tank or whatever. I've never ridden one of these. I would assume that it's not going to be nearly as nice a wind protection as the KLR or the T7, but probably not too far off either, since you do still have some pretty big panels on the side here and a nice big, well, somewhat large windshield that you could swap out for something bigger. So it should be pretty comfortable as far as the road performance goes. Should make you read through a lot here to get to any information that you actually want. We've got a 63.5 degree steering head angle, which I want to say is like sort of the, I guess, opposite measurement of what we were looking for before, I think, if that makes sense, I guess. Let's see if that comes out right. So 63.5 minus 90, so 26.5. So that would be the sort of apples to apples comparison to the rake that we were looking at on the Transalp. And I believe that one was a 27 degree, and I think I was not able to find it for the V-Strom, but that one was also, I believe, a 27. Set up for being off-road, for sure. And it looks like here we've got the rest of our technical details here. Let's show everything. That doesn't look like anything I want. So I'll have to go over to the specifications department here on the KTM website. And now this has got a few more things that we're interested in here. Like I said before, in horsepower numbers, that is 43. Max torque here shows 37 Newton meters. That's only 27 foot-pounds of torque. So in comparison for the KLR, we've got 3 more horsepower, but almost, well, a quarter of the, more than a quarter of the torque missing. So that's not great, but the bike is much lighter, so all right, here's some more numbers we need. Front suspension travel 177 millimeters, rear 177. In English, that's going to be 6.7 inches up front and 7 inches in the rear. So in comparison there, obviously we are substantially lower than the rest of the bikes that we've been looking at today, and mixed with the pretty lackluster ground clearance of this thing. 200 millimeters, that equates to only 7.9 inches, which is quite a bit less than everything else. It's not looking great. I've got to say, though, this one does have me pretty intrigued, and I've actually got a line on one at a dealer that is selling it for a bit less because it's on sale, because it's at the end of the year here now, than the sort of MSRP number I found. Supposedly, these are going for $7,399, but the one that I found is down in the 6,000s. So it almost seems like maybe some of these sort of lackluster components of this maybe aren't going to be that big of a deal if I can get this for KLR money. I mean, obviously this is not a hardcore ready-to-race off-road KTM, but it's still a KTM. And even though that suspension doesn't maybe have as much travel, I have to imagine that it is set up better for off-road, or at least designed with off-road in mind, where it seems like a lot of the other bikes, or at least the KLR anyways, off-road is really more of an afterthought than anything. But I guess it's really not going to be something that I can tell you guys for sure until I ride the thing. Boy, I sure would like to ride one. But before I do that, let's take a look at another bike that I cannot ride because it is now currently only available overseas, but it seems like it should be here sometime next year or maybe the year after. Who really knows? The Royal Enfield Himalaya 450. I got pretty darn excited about this bike when I saw Itchy Boots on it for the first time. I sort of purposely live under a rock and try to ignore all types of media and news information. I guess maybe I need to keep up a little bit better on the ADV world, but when I saw this bike for the first time, I got pretty darn excited about it. I always thought the old Himalayan was a decent bike and definitely something that was interesting, but not nearly as interesting as this thing. This looks like a real lightweight adventure bike, and it looks like a lightweight adventure bike from this era, at least. They still have a bit of sort of retro styling, which I definitely think is cool, but man, it definitely got a much needed upgrade both in the looks and the engine department here. I'm not sure I'm a fan of the circle dash here, though. It's not off-putting. It really makes sense. You get to see the clearest picture of everything around where you are. But it's just too goofy for me, I think. I don't know. Maybe I'd get used to it. Either way, definitely a very interesting motorcycle and something that I am pretty excited to see. It seems like parts of it, like the forks here, I think they're only a 43 millimeter. Still seem a little bit small, but I think part of that is just in my head. I think you need this giant bike to ride off-road, and obviously that is kind of what I'm trying to get away from looking at these small bikes because I don't want something that is so massive that it could possibly break part of my appendage off. Part of my appendage off? One of my appendages? Break my leg. I don't want to break my leg. So they have a wealth of information on this for us. Oh, it's got a new LED tail light and signal lights. Awesome. Actually, LED signal lights are a really good idea. All bikes should have those. That bright flash definitely makes a difference. Quick flash? The quick flash definitely makes a difference. So for the wheels, we've got a 21-inch front, which of course we'd like to see. Definitely gives it a bit of a leg up over its last competitor that we were just looking at there. We've got a 17 in the rear, which is all right. Same as a KLR, can't complain about that too much. 17-liter fuel tank, which equates to a 4.5-gallon tank. That's almost 3/4 of a gallon more than the KTM. Puts out 40 horsepower and 30 foot-pounds of torque, so 3 less horsepower and 3 more foot-pounds of torque. Looks like this does already come with a skid plate on the exhaust. That doesn't seem great. Does also have upper crash protection, which maybe would bend like licorice, maybe not. I don't know that people actually put aftermarket protection on these as far as crash bars go. Now, there are still a lot of unknowns with this bike. As best I could tell, it seems like people think that this is going to come in somewhere just above the old Himalayan, which was somewhere right around 5-6 grand, depending where you found one. I would assume that this is going to be pretty similarly priced to the KTM 390, since, like I said, this is sort of a close competitor. My guess is somewhere between 6,000 and 7,000, which is not bad for everything that you're getting here. It seems like they've really, really tried to push to make this bike a much more modern adventure bike. And I think some people probably will not like that. I don't know how I feel about ride-by-wire yet. I guess maybe we'll find out. So seat height is going to be a pretty comfortable 825 millimeters off the ground. And if you refuse to use a measurement system that actually makes sense, then this seat is 32.5 inches off the ground, which isn't bad. I don't think they mentioned weight at all here, at least not that I could find, but from what I found elsewhere, it seems like this bike is going to come in right at around 432 pounds wet. So that's definitely going to be appreciated off-road. On the highway, well, maybe that couple extra pounds might make you feel a little bit more planted, but the bike seems fairly sleek and low to the ground, and I think should do okay. Obviously, both of these are not really intended as highway bikes, but I think from what I've heard, both of them can definitely run on the highway for decent extended periods of time. Looks like we've got lots and lots and lots of color options, which is really kind of cool. Some of these are pretty neat. This bike, I believe, also does have a 6th gear, so that definitely is something that I think kind of gives all of these a bit of a leg up over the KLR 650. All right, now let's head down to the garage and see what I decided on. Is what I would say if I had decided on anything at all, but honestly, I just cannot make up my mind about this. I've been thinking about it for so long, and I guess I would really appreciate your guys' input, so I will put the name of each one of these bikes down in a comment. If you guys want to just hit the thumbs up button on whichever bike you think is interesting. If you think more than one is interesting, that's fine too. Vote on all 4 of them if you want. The Transalp 750 seems like a pretty good option if you're somebody that's going to spend a little bit more time on the road, because I'm looking for a bike that I can really kind of push off-road and something that I can even push more off-road than the KLR. I just don't really think it's the smartest next step for me. I think if you're somebody that's on a KLR that really doesn't find yourself off-road a whole lot, then honestly the Transalp is probably going to be your best option. I think for me, sort of by default, but honestly not really, and just because the V-Strom is such a great bike, I think the V-Strom is the one that I would end up with. The added ground clearance that it's got, the suspension travel that's better than the KLR, I think all of those things are really going to make it a much more enjoyable bike. Not to mention that it has a 6th gear and literally double the horsepower of the KLR. I think the V-Strom is going to be a great option if you are on a KLR and you're looking for something that is going to be even better off-road and even better on-road. It's a little bit heavier, but honestly, from what I've heard, it seems like the bike carries its weight down low enough that it might not even matter that it's heavier than the KLR. It might actually feel lighter. So that's definitely interesting and certainly has intrigued me. I, for a while, really was thinking that was going to be the bike that I'm going to buy. Now that I've started to consider some of the lighter ones, I think the Himalayan 450 would probably be the best move if they were available right now. But because I need to put food on the table by putting videos out, obviously, that's not really going to be an option right now. However, the KTM 390 has been out for a while. The new spoked wheels as of last year is something that I think will open this bike up to more riders, but I'm honestly not sure if that's going to be really a good thing. And I guess until I rode the bike off-road, it'd be hard to say. It seems like it's got some off-road capability, but I guess what I would really like to know is if you're somebody like me that has really been able to push a large bike, if you hop on this thing, being that it's maybe not as off-road friendly as some of the other bikes that I've ridden, like the KLR and the Tenere, am I going to be able to ride just as well as I did on the big bike? Will I be able to maybe even ride better because it actually fits me rather than being 4 times my weight? I don't know. I'm interested to find out, and I think the KTM 390 is probably the one that I'll end up with, but honestly, I'm not sure. So maybe you guys can convince me one way or the other down in the comment section. Don't be afraid to vote down there. Thanks for watching, guys. Take care. Stay safe. Stay swanky. Get out. Enjoy this beautiful world any chance you get. And if you can't do that right now, well, there's lots of YouTube videos to check out, and you can try to make a decision on what bike you're going to buy.